I'll do one more stitch. All right. Hey there. Thanks for joining me. I'm Jean Farish, and this is my fourth FlossTube video, and we have a lot to talk about today. I'm going to start with Lady Virginia. I've been talking a bit about her lately. This is the project that we talked about last week where I demonstrated how to find a starting place. I folded my fabric in quarters, folded it in half. In fact, it was this piece. I folded it in half, and then I folded it in half again, found my center, and from there I counted up and out to find my place to start. In this case, I wanted to start in the upper right-hand corner so I could work across the piece doing the Victorian cross, and then from that corner down. What I want to talk about today is how I knew where to stop stitching. Since I wanted to stitch the Victorian cross, I started in my upper right-hand corner and stitch across. Now, when I got close to where I thought I needed to end, I stopped and put in these little very loose stitches, which I call tailor's tacks, just little overhand kind of stitches every 20 stitches. So I have 20, 40, 60, 80. So at this point, I needed 13 more stitches to get to the corner. Once I did get to the corner, I then started stitching down, and again put in tailor's tacks every 20 stitches, and then when I got close to the corner, again counted 93. Now, because I'm using the Victorian cross, at this point I turned my work upside down, and now I'm continuing to stitch across this way. Now, what I want to point out to you is a little bit of math. This answers a question that was sent in by Diana. She said, I found a sampler I'm thinking of trying out. There's a simple border, just one stitch all the way around. Is it good to start there to make sure it all lines up? Now, of course, since this is a square, or even if it were a rectangle, I don't need to count all the sides. Once I've counted and I know that I have the right number of stitches across the top, and I know I have the right number of stitches down the side, I can just keep stitching those two lines until they meet in the other corner, and then I know that it's right. So when stitching a larger and more complicated sampler like Janet Irving, I proceed in a very different way. I start in the upper left-hand corner, and I work across the top border, and I usually work the first two lines of the sampler before I turn this corner and start down the other side. And I do that for reasons of just safety, to make sure that my count is correct, because I figure that if my top border and the first two lines of the sampler line up with each other, then I'm good to go. And at that point, I work down the side borders and across the lines, kind of piggyback. You know, I do a little of the left, a little of the right, and work on the middle. Now, I recognize that not every sampler stitcher works in that way. And again, I just can't say often enough that whatever works for you is fine. There are a lot of sampler stitchers who want to do the complete border before they start doing the middle. And I read lots of posts on Facebook and on other needlework forums where people say, I got to the fourth corner and it all matched up and I am so relieved. And I do have to ask myself, why go through that stress? I mean, by working across the top and down each side as I'm doing the middle, then I'm not going to have to worry about that. There are enough other things in my life that I try not to worry about, but certainly more serious things I need to be concerned about than whether or not the fourth corner of my sampler is going to match or not. But with all that said, if you are a complete sampler border stitcher before you start doing the middle, that's okay too. So that's really all there is to say about that. Another great question that I got was from Jacinta. I hope I'm saying your name right. And she asked whether or not cross-stitch fabrics have a right and wrong side, and whether or not they have an up and a down. And the other part of that unasked question is, do they have a up and down compared to sideways? And so I want to talk about all of that a little bit here and talk about linen in general. And what I'm about to talk about in these next few minutes are all about linen. Linen is an even weave. I just want to be really clear about that. Modern day stitchers, and I want to say that this has happened more like in the last 10 or 20 years than say 30 or 40 years ago when I started my company. Somehow people have categorized that there's a category of linen and there's a category of even weave. And that is just not true. Linen is an even weave. It is woven evenly. The same number of threads are going across as going up and down. In other words, in weaving terms, the warp and the weft are the same. The same number of threads are making up each of those two directions. And that's what defines even weave. Linen, to be called linen, has to be made from 100% flax. And flax is a plant. It is grown to be used in fiber production, to be making cloth and other things, just as cotton is a plant and is grown to make fabric and other things as well. So that is the distinction between linen and even weave. Even weave is a fabric made of something other than flax. So I'll get off my soapbox now and talk about the specifics. To use another weaving term, the linen that we use for counted thread work is a plain weave. It is woven so you're over, under, over, under, over, under a thread. There are other types of weaves. For example, the denim that our blue jeans are made out of is a twill. So it's might be over 2 and under 1, over 2 and under 1. And then the next row is offset. So that's getting into a whole lot of weaving terms. But I just want to be clear that the linen and even weaves that we stitch with are also what we call plain weaves. And that's what makes them so beautiful for doing counted thread work. With that in mind, there is a difference between the up and down and the sideways. To a weaver, there's a huge difference. To a needle worker, I want to say not so much. Unless your fabric comes to you with the selvage still intact, you don't know which is the top and which is the side. There's no way of telling. So don't make yourself crazy about that. If you do have a piece and it has the selvage attached to it, then the selvage is the sides. That's the long way. However, if what you want to stitch for that particular piece of fabric fits, if you turn it 90 degrees, that's okay. Again, my opinion. And I want to tell you, I am not a textile expert by any stretch of the imagination. And I hope that there are not textile experts out there pulling their hair out, because that would be unfortunate. But in my experience of 40 years of stitching professionally, I don't see a difference. I also don't see a difference from the front or back of a traditional piece of linen or even weave. Now, if it's printed or if it's an over-dyed, then yes, you might see a difference between the front and the back. But it's not like, if you're a home sewer, if you took home ec like I did back in the 50s and 60s and whenever they stopped teaching home ec, I don't know. But if you do a lot of home sewing, then most fabric comes to you off of a bolt with a front and a back. That is not the case with your traditional cross-stitch fabrics. So now what I want to do is take a close-up look at a couple of very different types of linens. Now, all the things I'm about to show you are all linen, which means that they're all woven with flax. And yet, there's a huge difference between them. And I'm not just talking about the count. I'm also talking about just the way it's woven. So a picture's worth 1,000 words. So let me get my close-up camera set up and I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to start with this sample, obviously one that's already stitched. This is 32 count Belfast linen from Zweigart. The color is cream, and I'm going to slip something black underneath of this so that you can see the weave a little bit better. And let me come in a whole lot closer to see the characteristics of this particular linen. This one, I would say, is very regular in the linen threads that are used to weave the fabric. We need to talk about slubs a little bit before we go too much further. And just to make sure that we all know that we're talking about the same thing. This, for example, this is a slub. Let me find some others in here if I can. And they go in both directions. Here's one that's very well defined. And let me find one that's going sideways. Whoops, that's off camera. Right here on top of the letter. Whoops, where am I? Trying to find the letter O. Okay, right here across the top of the letter O. So they can be both in the warp and in the weft, in the sideways threads as well as the up and down threads. Now, looking at this right here, can you see this point right here? That's where you've got a slub kind of going in both directions, that's crossing the weave. Now, a lot of people, they look at slubs and they see a flaw. To someone who loves linen, as I do, a slub is not a flaw. It's an imperfection. It is a characteristic of the fabric. And slubs are one of the two main reasons why there are people who love even weave and do not like stitching on linen. They think that the slubs get in their way. They see them as an imperfection. And again, that is a matter of taste, and there's no right or wrong in that regard. But I don't see any value in looking down on linen because of slubs, since that's an intrinsic part of the fabric, and that's what makes it what it is. The other reason there are people who love even weave and do not love linen is because the threads that are used to weave the linen are not a consistent thickness. And again, I'm going to see if I can find an example here in Belfast. But this is also an opportunity to tell you that that is one of the things that separates one type of linen from another. Belfast, in my opinion, is pretty consistent in the thickness of the up and down as well as the side to side threads. So let's take a look at another sample that's maybe not as consistent. And this one is Studio Line Barley Cream. Okay, so, and by the way, I label my linen samples so that I can keep track of what's what. I can't always tell just by glancing at them. So here, okay, let's see. You can see where you've got, okay, here's a good example, where you've got a really thin thread right next to a really fat thread. And again, that is a characteristic of linen. It's not something wrong with it. I don't want to imply at all that this is an inferior piece of linen, because it is not. In fact, this is an opportunity for me to tell you why I particularly like Studio Line linen. Here's another sample. different color, obviously. And if you like to stitch kind of a rustic look, then this is a good linen to give you that. But what is particularly valuable to me for something like studio line is when I'm doing white work. And this is my doodle cloth. So this is just full of just, like I say, just doodles. When you're doing, where am I? Here we go. Okay, when you're doing pulled thread work, the whole idea of pulled thread is that you're stitching with such a tight tension that you're pulling the linen threads together in one direction or the other, and sometimes both. And that's what gives you these wonderful, open, lacy looked stitches. You are not going to get that from this linen. Because notice, let me see if I can rearrange this so that the two are right side by side here. Do you see where in this sample there's more space between the linen threads? It is woven in a more open fashion. This is a much tighter weave over here. You can see a lot more of the black background behind this one. The value of that when you are doing pulled thread work is that there's more open space to allow you to pull those linen threads together to get the kind of open, lacy look that you get when you're trying to do this. You're not ever going to get this type of a look on a tightly woven linen. So it's not just the color, it's not just the count, it's also how thick and thin the linen threads are, and also how closely they are woven together. So let me tell you about my framing disaster. And to fully understand why I'm reframing one of my vintage pieces, a little bit of backstory might be helpful. As a professional teacher and designer, my projects travel a lot. In fact, they travel more than I do. They are sent in boxes and trunks in the backseat of cars. They're hand carried, they're put in suitcases, whatever. And so for that reason, I don't put glass in my pieces that are going to travel. Because in my opinion, when you ship something with glass in it, you're asking for trouble. If that glass breaks, you can end up with little fragments of glass embedded in your work, or even worse, if a shard of the broken glass can cut your ground cloth or your stitching threads. And that would just be a disaster beyond even, I can't even think about what it would take to fix that. What I'm about to tell you is easy to fix compared to if I shipped something with glass and the glass broke. So that's why I am redoing it, was to add glass to a piece that I had not planned on traveling any longer. So all I expected to do was to take the wire off the back, take the paper off the back, have my framer that I love, my current local framer, have them put in a spacer and glass, repaper the back, add the wire to the back, bring it home and hang it up. However, when I took it apart, what I discovered was that whoever framed this originally stapled the work to a hardtack backing board of some type. That's number one. Number two, all the materials they used were not acid-free. And number three, somebody used pencil to draw a line around the perimeter to know where to line it up on the backing board. Any one of those three things would have been a problem, but for all three of them to be in one project was it just blew my mind. Now, keep in mind, I feel like I am pretty careful about who I choose to frame my things. This was framed 25 years ago. And so I don't recall exactly who framed it. I kind of wish I did remember. And maybe if I go back in all my paperwork, I would find it. But I really don't remember. I do know it's not the company that I use now. So I say all that to remind you to have a conversation with your framer. You have put a lot of hours into your work. You have put money into your work in terms of materials. And now you're going to put even more money into it in terms of framing. So do not hesitate to ask the hard questions. And do not hesitate to demand that you have the quality of work that your piece deserves. Acid-free materials. And in my opinion, the only two ways to mount needlework are with pinning or lacing. And in a future videotape, I will talk more about exactly how to mount a piece of needlework. And the third thing is no pencil. Graphite is one of the worst things you can do to needlework. Now, I have washed this piece twice in preparing it for today's video. And let me put my close-up glasses on so I can see what I'm showing you. And you can still see the pencil lines. See these pencil lines? That's not going to come out. It's not ever going to come out. The other thing, and let me put this piece of blackboard underneath of it to show you. Look at the damage that was done to the needlework from the staples. The actual linen threads have been cut by the staples. And also, and I'm really hoping that the camera will pick this up. Maybe I need to go back to the white underneath this. Can you see the difference in color between this part and this part? Do you see where over here it's more yellow? Now that's damage that was done just in 25 years. Because what the framer did, and this is sort of, you know, if there's any good news in this, the good news is that they made a sandwich. They had a backing board, and you can see all the staple holes. They had a backing board that was not acid-free. They layered it with a piece of paper that is acid-free. And then when they put the needlework on there to frame it, you know, lining up their pencil lines with the edges of the board, and then wrapping it around to the back. Fortunately, the face of the work was only touching acid-free material, and it's the material that was pulled around to the back that was in contact with the material that was not acid-free. So I am hoping to be able to remount this. I had a piece of foam core, acid-free foam core, cut to the same dimensions as the original board. Let me tell you, the other reason why I was taking this out is because this is just, you know, this has just always been one of my absolute favorite designs. And I did the original as a commemorative sampler for the Spirit of Cross Stitch festivals in 1996. And so previously it said Spirit of Cross Stitch across here. And in order to make this design readily available to everyone, I took that out and restitched it. That's what I'm doing with this piece. So you'll be able to look for this in the next within the next month. Hopefully as few as a couple more weeks, this will be available in shops. So look for that. I call this the hare in the basket, and it's just a fun stitch. Peg sent me a great question. She asked me if I could discuss mistakes a little bit. She said, do you always rip them out, or when do you rip out a mistake? What if you don't notice the mistake until you have stitched a long way? So there are really two different answers to this question. One is if I'm stitching for something that's going to be a cover to one of my own publications, which frankly is most of the time that I spend stitching, I want to make sure that the photo you see and the chart you see match so there's no confusion. And that's a different category of stitching than if you're stitching just for your own pleasure. If I were stitching just for myself and no one's going to see it but myself and the people who come into my home, I would not be quite as diligent or as persnickety. And a great example of that is I talked last week about Jane Hattersley and how I made a mistake in stitching the way Jane stitched her letter X and the way I stitched the letter X were different. So yes, I ripped that out so that you, the consumer, if you choose to buy that chart when it's ready, won't be confused. If I had not been stitching for that reason, I probably would have kept right on going and made an adjustment somewhere else. Now, I would have had to make some kind of adjustment because I would have been off by one stitch. So the questions I would ask myself are these. How much effort is the workaround going to be? If I'm going to have to constantly be juggling the way the rest of the stitching goes in order to compensate for a mistake I made, to me, it wouldn't be worth it. Or if it's going to constantly bug me. So my rule of thumb is, for you, is if you ask more than 2 people, do you see this mistake? Or does this mistake bother you? Then that is proof positive that it's bothering you. And for that reason, rip it out. And when I do rip out, I use the old Band-Aid philosophy. I just rip it out. And I don't mean carelessly. I mean, it's like, you know, if you have ever taken the Band-Aid off of the knee of a child, and it does hurt. You know, it's painful for that adhesive to come off. And so, but the kindest thing you can do to that child with the Band-Aid on their knee is to rip it off quickly and just be done with it. And that's why I say when I rip out needlework, I think in terms of a Band-Aid philosophy. When you rip out, the only 2 tools I would suggest using are your needle and a pair of embroidery scissors. Do not use a seam ripper. It's called a seam ripper. You're not ripping out a seam. You're ripping out needlework stitches. There's too much of a chance that seam ripper is going to rip your ground cloth. It just isn't worth it. So yes, I take it out stitch by stitch with my needle. And after I've taken 3 or 4 stitches out, I take my scissors and clip off that excess, because there's just no sense in dragging 3 inches of floss through your linen. You're just making more work for yourself. So have your scissors handy, take 3 or 4 stitches out, clip off that thread, and take the next 3 or 4 out. In general, if I can rip it out from the back, then I do, because I think there's less chance that I'll end up injuring stitches that I don't intend to take out. And one more word of caution. One of the worst things in my experience relative to ripping out is when you are done ripping out and you find out you ripped out the wrong stuff, because I have done that. So just, take care to know exactly what you're ripping out. Take care in terms of ripping it out and not injuring the surrounding stitches or your fabric. And then just be done with it. That's when I put on a chick flick that I enjoy watching, and I just sit back and just take it out, because you know what? It is part of the process. Okay. Here was a great question. Somebody asked me what size needle I was using, because they said, and again in capital letters, because the needle you're using is huge. Actually, when you are seeing me on camera, I am using either number 26 or number 28 needle. It looks huge because it's close up. So that's an easy one. Need to put on my reader so I can read. Tara sent in this. Have you always stitched in hand? If you started with a hoop or frame of some kind, how did you transition to in hand? I currently use a hoop most of the time, and I've always told myself I need the fabric drum tight but your stitching in hand looks so comfortable and smooth. Thank you. I've always thought it would be convenient to be able to sit down, pick up my fabric, and just start stitching. I've tried a bit of in hand, but I can't quite wrap my head around the idea of ending one stitch and beginning the next stitch all in one motion. So that's kind of a several part question. First of all, when you're stitching in hand, you can end one stitch and begin the next one in one motion, and therefore be stitching on the face of the fabric all the time. I also stitch in hand, poke and pull. So the two of them are not so connected that if you do one, you can't do the other. And again, if I'm not careful, these FlossTube videos will get way too long. So I'll be talking about that more in the future. So that's one thing, is you can stitch in hand and do either sewing or poke and pull, or what I do ends up actually being a combination. The second part of that is, how tight does your fabric have to be? Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here because I realize that what I'm about to tell you is different from what many of my professional colleagues say and do. Keep in mind, you get to choose however you want to stitch. You don't have to stitch the way I stitch. I'm going to be telling you what works for me. And if you try it and you like it, fine. If you're not interested in trying it, that's okay too. If you try it and you love it, then you've added another tool to your tool belt. So the question is, does your ground cloth, whether it's linen or even weave or Aida, does it have to be drum tight? I don't believe that it does need to be drum tight. Not for this type of embroidery. There are types that are important. I took a wonderful class on silk shading at the Royal School of Needlework, and yes, I am name dropping, at Hampton Court Palace. It was wonderful. And in that class, it's important for the ground cloth to be drum tight. That's a different technique. I would not attempt to do silk shading any other way. But for this type of counted thread embroidery, I don't believe it has to be drum tight. And that's what makes it possible to stitch in hand. The critical thing with stitching in hand is for your tension to be consistent and for it to match your ground cloth. So basically, when I'm done, it's like my stitches become an intrinsic part of the fabric I'm stitching on. They're not tighter and they're not looser. They are the same tension as the fabric I'm working on. So, especially if you're stitching with linen, you will know immediately if your stitches are too tight, because you'll end up with gaps between the linen thread where you're stitching and the next one. So if you find that to be true, then just loosen up a little bit. I would not say that I got my tension right overnight. It took some time. For me, it was worth it because, as Tara mentions in her question, that she would love to just be able to pick up her needlework and go. That is one of the reasons I like stitching in hand. I find embroidery hoops and Q-snaps to be cumbersome. It's one more apparatus that I have to carry around. I like for my needlework to be portable. Now, I am not a person who has a place in my home where I stitch with a floor frame and a special light and a magnifier. And again, there's nothing wrong with that scenario. Maybe I'm a little bit jealous of people who have that set up. I don't. Maybe it comes from raising active teenagers, where I have stitched at swim meets, I have stitched at field hockey games, I have stitched on the road, I have stitched on camping trips, I have stitched all over the place. That's my style of stitching. That doesn't have to be your style. It's also okay if you do both. You know, maybe you have that exquisite piece that you have on a floor frame and, you know, it's like, that's kind of your, I don't know, you have a special rapport with that piece. And then maybe you have a smaller piece that you can throw into a tote bag or your purse and can just have it on the go. And that is legitimate stitching. It's not like one or the other is better or best. There are two different styles of stitching, and they both have a place. They may both have a place in your life. They certainly both have the place in different people's lives. It just all depends on where you are and what your style of stitching is. So I think that answers that question. It may even be what they say, too much information. I don't know. Hey, I've come to the end of my list of questions and things that I earmarked to talk with you about today. So I guess it's time for me to say that I hope you turn in again next week. And in the meantime, stitch happy and be safe.